on the road. Just anybody who hasn't signed the attendance sheet, circulate and please sign it and pass it on to your neighbour, so we get that worked out.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And Colin isn't going to do the housekeeping talk, but toilets there, toilets on the thing. If the alarm rings, get the hell out of the building and you follow the signs. I think that's about the health and extent of my health and safety talk in relation to it. I'd like to welcome Mick O'Reilly, who's going to chair the session. And what I'm saying is, I think everybody in the room knows Mick. Born and raised in Dublin, raised in the Liberties in Ballyfermot, left primary school after an altercation with a Christian brother. So even at that stage in his life, he was ahead of his time. He worked at Sterling's, May Roberts, Lincoln and Nolan's, names that wouldn't be familiar to people now, I suppose. Car factory before becoming increasingly active in the trade union movement. He cut his political teeth in the Dublin Housing Action Committee and the Connolly Youth Movement. From the 1960s to the present day, he's been at different times a member of the Communist Party both in England and in this country, and in the Labour Party here in the 26 counties. But as far as I know, you're not in any political party at this particular moment in time. So he's reserving the right to remain silent. His trade union activity with the National Union of Vehicle Builders brought him to the leadership of the Amalgamated and Transport and General Workers Union in 1982. In 1992, when he became District Secretary of the Amalgamated Transport and General Workers Union, and he got a seat on the committee of the ICTU. 4 years later, he relocated to Belfast as the first Nationalist Regional Secretary. He was controversially dismissed from his position in 2001, only to be fully reinstated like Lazarus in 2004, following a bitter battle across two jurisdictions, and which mobilised the best and the worst in the trade union movement in that particular issue. His memoir, From Lucifer to Lazarus, is a proud, unadulterated testament of a life on the left. So I'll hand you over to Lazarus, who's going to chair this session.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Kevin for his kind remarks. And when I go home this evening, I'll spend the rest of the evening polishing the halo. And he's painted for me. First of all, I want to welcome you all to Unite. I'm delighted that this event is taking place here. It's not the first time. The old Amalgamated Transport had an association with the Greaves School going right back. Helena Sheehan, she has put together a series of books which I find, I haven't read them all, but I have read some of them, and they are most illuminating. They are some of the best recorded insights into the philosophy of Marxism, what it teaches us, how it teaches us, and the hope that comes from the analysis about change. The hope that comes from understanding the mode of production as being the most important thing that you can learn and get from Marxism. And that goes through everything that Helena writes about. And it's so important now not to run from our beliefs, not to run from our analysis. It's easy when you're swimming with the tide, but when the tide is against you, it's difficult. But if you're standing for truth, it's important to stand, to make your stand, to have your principles. You don't have to abandon practicality, but you don't abandon your principles. You have to be careful about the way you put them, but you don't run away from your analysis, because your analysis will explain, will give people hope, and will take the thing forward. I think I heard some of what Helena is going to say, because I've looked at some of it here. Because earlier last year, she spoke at the 50th anniversary of the foundation of the Irish Labour History Society. I have to say, I would not have went to the weekend had it not been for Helena speaking and for another couple of things that were on the agenda, because I was enraged at the idea that the organisers invited IBEC to participate in the event of our history. Now, IBEC have a place in industrial relations, but we have no business inviting them when we're going to analyse our own history. That's our business, not theirs. Right? And we get things foggy and mixed up because we do things like that. It's because we don't have a proper thought process in the movement. And if Helena doesn't mind me saying so, I watched some of the people who were there, and it was like throwing a bucket of cold water over them to wake them up about what the realities of class struggle is about. And she does this very eloquently in all the work and the articles that she's done. And it's so important, I think, that people will, I hope they buy the books and listen to the lecture, and I'm, as I say, I'm delighted to be able to do this, because I think it explains the world to us. I think it shows us a way forward, and I think Marxism is still the thing that illuminates the possibility of a better future, better than any other philosophy on this earth. So I'll ask Helena to say what she's got to say.
Well, thank you to Kevin and to Mick. I'm honoured by what you had to say. Thank you all for coming and thinking that I had something to say that was worth a bit of time on a Saturday afternoon. So I'm going to talk about Marxism and its idea about class and the relationship between class and these other factors. But I'm talking about Marx, unlike the title here about Marx, I'm talking about Marxism. And Marxism is a long and complex intellectual tradition and political movement, and Marx was only one man in that history. I don't like the fact that a whole complex thing is named after one man, but you know, I didn't get a say in that. But what I have to say is what I have to say about these things, because I'm a Marxist and this is what I think. But I want to say I stand on the shoulders of giants in thinking this and saying this, one of whom, of course, is Marx. These are the questions. See? Okay, I thought the space bar
should move it, yeah.
Okay, so these are the questions which I intend to deal with in the course of this talk. So, what is class? I mean, people in this room, of course, know what class is, but the word class is used in a very loose and, I think, inaccurate way, in a very different way than the way Marxists use it in ordinary discourse. So, who is the working class today? It's become quite complicated. Who's the working class today? Is class analysis still relevant? Many people say it's not. Most of us in this room, I think, maybe by the very fact of coming here, think that it is. Why is class analysis, if it is still relevant? Why is it so marginalized? And then how does class intersect with race, gender, ethnicity, and other factors? And I'm going to move here into identity politics and also intersectionality theory. And ask, does intersectionality theory give due priority to class? And I want to deal then with what is the problems with identity politics. So first, what is class? So as I say, the term is used very loosely, but it's used in a much more precise way by Marxism. And it's a key concept with Marxism. In a lot of ordinary discourse, it's just, if it's talked about at all, it's just one more thing among others. But for Marxism, it is a key concept and a precise concept. It's the concept used to locate the place that a person occupies in the social division of labor and distribution of wealth. It specifies their basic relationship to the means of production, distribution, and exchange. It is not defined by education, culture, income, accent, home ownership, or neighborhood, although all of these are related to class. So, Marxism on class and class structure. For Marxism, there are two main classes. The bourgeoisie, that is, those who own the means of production, and the proletariat, those who depend on wage labor for their livelihood. So there are also strata within classes. There are residual classes and intermediate classes. But basically, say, within the bourgeoisie, there's the high bourgeoisie and the low bourgeoisie, the haute bourgeoisie, the petty bourgeoisie. And I think it's self-evidently people who own large-scale production would be the high bourgeoisie. And the petty bourgeoisie would be people that own small businesses and shops. And often some of these people have more in common with the working class, and in fact lower income and more precarity than people who have really secure jobs as wage laborers. And now there's what's often called, in a lot of contemporary discourse, even among Marxists, there's constant references to the PMC, the professional managerial class. This is not, to me, a class, it's a strata. It's actually strata that actually is intermediate between classes. But because the person is a professional, a lot of us in this room would be people that would be categorized as PMC. Certainly, any of us that are university professors, even trade union officials, the way some people use these categories. Educated people who have white-collar jobs are, considered to be, the way people talk, this professional managerial class. But basically, it's a stratum. Many of the people within this PMC are, in fact, working class. They're wage laborers. And other ones who have these big off-the-scale salaries, like some professors, some managers, some soccer stars, have just so much surplus income, obscene income, that they're able to own the means of production, in the sense that they have, pretty, extensive share portfolios. So, they work for a kind of wage, but that wage is so huge that they actually, are invested in the means of production. But, most people who are teachers, doctors, managers are, in fact, wage laborers. And then the people that are obviously considered workers, manual workers, office workers. And then the whole category of the lumpen proletariat. This isn't a term that's used very often anymore. But it's people who don't work, but actually live off other people's work. People are criminals and whatever. But it's something that the left doesn't really talk about that much anymore. but I think sometimes we should. And then there are also residual classes like aristocracy, monarchy. These come from the feudal mode of production. And they still survive, to my amazement, every single time I see or hear a story about British royalty. How do they still exist? But they're also a kind of intermediate class in the sense they are highly invested in capitalism. And they own extensive property and share portfolios, most royalty. So, who is the working class today? So, the typical proletarian would be people like Sam Nolan, Mick O'Reilly, some of you here, people who are male manual workers, typically, construction workers that belong in trade unions. But the working class today, or is still these people who are still, male manual laborers who belong to trade unions, and, they're important in terms of who's the working class. But the working class today is male and female. It's of diverse racial and ethnic origins, with varying levels of education and income, who may or may not own homes, who may or may not belong to trade unions. But it includes teachers, as I say, even sometimes professors, nurses, doctors, clerical workers, and many people who are, security employed on very good wages. So what makes us working class is our relation to the means of production, the fact that we depend on wage labor to live. The great divide is between those who do the work of the world and those who parasite on their labor, those who extract surplus value from labor without laboring. So who's the working class today? I think we have a great culture when it comes to expressing this. There's just so many songs, for example, that express this so strongly. There's this great anthem, Solidarity Forever. It's we who plowed the prairies, built the cities where they trade, dug the mines and built the workshops, endless miles of railway laid. Now we stand outcast and starving amidst the wonders we have made. They have taken untold millions that they never toiled to earn. But without our brain and muscle, not a single wheel can turn. So this is the working class. Those who live by their labor. Those who work by hand or brain. Who make the world as we know it happen. Whether plumbers or pilots or professors. Whether they build houses, stack shelves, perform surgery, or pursue scientific research. Of all genders, races, and ethnicities and nations. The many who are manipulated by capital into serving the interests of the few. And I'm not going to read this whole poem, but this is a poem that just states this brilliantly. It's by Bertolt Brecht, and it's called Questions from a Worker Who Reads. It's basically, who built Thebes of the Seven Gates? In the books, you'll read the names of kings, but did the kings haul up the lumps of rock? And it goes on like that. All the wonders of the world, everything that's built around us. This was built by human labor. And it belongs to those who labored. So, class and capitalism. Why do so few have so much? How has this happened? Are they really so much more brilliant and hardworking than everybody else? I would argue that all that's of value comes from either the natural world or for human labor. And most things that are of value come from some combination of both of these. So everyone who exists, everyone who's ever existed, has the same number of hours in their day. So why should some people who spend maybe some hours organizing production, and entrepreneurial work is labor, but why should they be able to accrue more in a few seconds than someone engaging in manual labor for an entire year? And that is the case with people like Bezos and Musk, Zuckerberg. What they take from this whole process, which is a collective process, is obscene. Absolutely obscene. Even worse than that, because they do engage in some kind of entrepreneurial activity, even if the case of Musk is absolutely ludicrous, kind of destroying what was a rather interesting platform. But anyway, even worse, why should others who have never in their whole lives done any labor but inherit wealth, whether in terms of stocks and shares, or in the case of the monarchy next door, the crown, why should they be able to have such enormous wealth which has been extracted from the labor of others? How did so much that is built by so many come to be expropriated by so few? It has not, on the whole, been through their own efforts, despite the whole rags to riches myth. It's not come from genius, invention, or entrepreneurial skill on the whole. These are sometimes factors. But it has come largely by force, whether by marauding armies or through oligarchic manipulation of the state, passing and enforcing laws that favor such expropriation. So, is class analysis still relevant? I'm sure you're all familiar with this class pyramid. It's a wobbly image of the industrial workers of the world. This is somebody that's attempted to do a contemporary version of this class pyramid. There are all kinds of ways that it could be drawn, but you get the idea. I think that the whole wobbly thing is very powerful, and still needs to be posted around the place. Should have one here now in this hall. So, class analysis. Is class analysis still meaningful? Now, it's undoubtedly, a lot of people say it's not, because class really is more complex today than it was in the past. It was much clearer in earlier decades, who was a capitalist and who was a worker. And it has become more complex. But for this very reason, it's more relevant than ever to engage in class analysis. So this raises the question, one reason, why is class analysis so marginalized in contemporary public discourse? Of course, one reason is that it's become more complex, but that's not the only reason. The primary reason why it's become so marginalized in contemporary discourse is that capitalism functions as a system in such a way as to mask the nature of itself as a system. And this makes it more effective for the dominant class to exercise power over subordinate classes. And as the great Marxist Gramsci elucidated so well in his concept of hegemony, that they exercise this power both through coercion and also by consent. And how they do this by consent is the thing that we really need to be very sharp about. So, class and class consciousness. Why do subordinate classes adopt the ideology of dominant classes as if it was common sense? This is a very powerful thing. That those who rule the world, I listen to RTE and I listen to people who have NUJ cards, and they speak with the voice of the masters of the universe. They've internalized the ideology of those who rule the world, both at home and abroad. So, the complexity of contemporary capitalism makes all of this very difficult to deal with. But they're all the taken for granted assumptions of mainstream political discourse. And it drives me crazy every single day on RTE. I listen to a lot of current affairs radio when I'm doing things around the house. And I know this is true of all of the media, but I think it's more serious in the case of RTE because it's public service broadcasting, it's ours. And it's more a violation that they speak with the voice of the masters of the universe in public service broadcasting. And just there's a whole row of popular culture. There's just so many ways in which this plays itself out, how drama is structured, all kinds of things. It's there all the time, certain assumptions about who has power and whether it's okay that they have power. I mean, the whole way that the US election is covered in Irish media really drives me crazy, as if there is so much at stake, like the future of civilization is at stake as to whether Harris or Trump win the US election. And they're both very bad choices if you look at the world this way. And in some ways, the Democratic Party would be worse, certainly in terms of how the US exercises imperial power in the rest of the world. But they're seriously bad choices on both sides of that. So, what I argue is that what should be as clear as the rising sun becomes very confused because the prevailing climate clouds over what should be so clear. It fills the space with clutter and noise and diverts even progressive impulses into blind alleys. Here's an example, this notion, trickle-down economics. And there's a drawing that explains clearly trickle-down economics. It might be a bit simplified, but, more or less, it tells, I think, a true story. But this is to instill the belief, fairly effectively, a lot of the time, that what's good for those who own the means of production is what's good for all of us. And it's not. It's just not. So, some problems about some modes of discourse about class. The main problem about discourse and class is that there's so little of it. There is so little discussion of class. But then when there is discussion of class, I want to argue that there's some serious problems with it. For example, and I'm using, examples of things that aren't egregious, things that seem to be progressive. There was a conference in Dublin in 2021 on working class studies. I thought, yay, because academe wants to talk about everything except class. Gender, race, diversity, every possible gender. But class, so yay, this is great. Working class studies. And it was good in many ways, don't get me wrong. There are a lot of people from a working class background telling their stories and whatever. But it was mostly focused on class as culture and as identity rather than as work. There was almost no reference to capitalism, to class struggle, to politics, to socialism, to the left. The one force, which has been raising class in terms of Ireland over the decades. A couple of years before that, I went to a conference at UCD on The Wire. And I've written an analysis of The Wire. I think The Wire is really quite brilliant. It's not written by a Marxist, but I think in many ways it explores what's going on in all different sections of society in a way where, a Marxist could say, yes, this is where we need drama to go. And there was one session at this conference that was about The Wire and class. In fact, there's a whole season of The Wire which deals with the deindustrialization of Baltimore and the different generations of the working class and the different types of class consciousness. And, it shows, this prototypical male manual worker trying to understand how the world has changed all around him and that how his son and the other generations just don't see the world this way at all. And he stands in the harbor of Baltimore and he says, we used to make things. We used to do things. And it shows, the deindustrialization and the decline of class consciousness. The Wire is really quite brilliant. But, they were actually talking about class without talking about class. In a way that I find it happens a lot of times in academia and elsewhere when they do talk about class. They don't really get it. And there's also, there's been a long time in the left this critique of class reductionism. It does exist, but often it's a caricature. And then with identity politics, if somebody actually wants to raise issues of class in a way that is really strong and clear and core, I've heard it written off as white male identity politics, to reduce class politics to that. But this goes on, and it goes on within the left. And then there's a host syndrome on RTE. Very often there are these people who come from the working class, and they're on and they're telling their stories. And, they do it well in a certain way. It's good that this happens. But it creates this image of the working class as good as anybody else. There are multiple RTE interviews about people growing up in drug-infested working class communities, especially here in Dublin, rising above drug addiction, turning to education as a lever of social mobility, and making this case for the working class being in need of help from the right government policies. And there's this way of talking about the working class as the most vulnerable in our society, who need help. And the working class is not as good as anybody else. The working class is what makes the world go round. The working class is who make the world as we know it happen. The working class is those who do rather than those who ask for help. The working class are those who give rather than those who take. We have this Robert Trestle Festival in Dublin every year. And the title of that book, The Ragged-Trousered Philanthropists, these are the people who give to society. That's who the working class is. The working class without whom there is no society. So in contrast, there's organized labor. Aside from left parties, and not just parties, a lot of us on the left aren't in parties, much to our regret a lot of the time. But, aside from the organized left, there's organized labor. A big overlap, of course. But the trade union movement, in terms of public discourse and who gets heard, is often nearly alone in addressing the real relationship between production and consumption, production, distribution, and consumption, arguing that what people are demanding is what they've earned through their labor, not what they're asking, but what they're demanding because they've labored and they deserve it in justice, not charity, but justice. But even then, it's most often a matter of making the case in terms of specific disputes and what's being demanded in terms of wages and conditions for particular groups of workers. We rarely these days hear trade union officials speak about the working class as a class, making demands for radical distribution in terms of their overall role in social production. And I want to say Dublin Council of Trade Unions has stood out for decades in engaging in this kind of discourse. There's a picture there of Sam Nolan, who died 5 months ago today, who was always a strong voice for working class consciousness, and Nick O'Reilly and others, because the DCTU has been really important in this way. So, and also, there's a massive response to Mick Lynch when he found himself in the media spotlight and was speaking not only about railway workers and a specific dispute. Mick Lynch spoke and got a lot of media attention about the working class as a class, without whom the lights don't get turned on, the trains don't run, the streets aren't swept, the sick aren't nursed, the students aren't taught. And the clarity and the simplicity of this has resonated powerfully. And this has been important. So Marxism, as an intellectual tradition and political movement, has been the only force to put forward a systemic analysis of class under capitalism and a systemic alternative to capitalism. That is, social ownership of the means of social production, more just distribution and more efficient investment, not only in the enterprise itself, but in the whole social infrastructure on which the enterprise depends. And also, this is the only way to harness the resources of society and nature in such a way as to save our planet from the path of self-destruction on which we're currently hurtling along a trajectory that is inherent in the logic of capitalism. The Green Party don't get this. That the logic of ecology is contradictory to the logic of capitalism. And it's our job on the left to make this case. For example, you know, in the previous general election, 2020, the Greens have had this slogan, if you want green, vote green. Yeah. Whereas we say, if you want green, vote red. So how does class relate to gender, race, ethnicity, and other factors? So there's a lot of these things that have now gone mainstream come from the left, from the women's liberation movement, from the black liberation movement, black power movement. But a lot of what we fought for over the decades, and especially a lot of my generation fought for in the 60s, has now become mainstream. There's this whole trajectory of the liberation movement raising such issues and then, you know, them becoming something very different than what we envisaged when we set out along this path. So they're constant, as I said, there are constant accusations of class reductionism. There's this mainstreaming, containing, and co-opting of such struggles. You might say, well, isn't that a good thing if something that you raised become mainstream? And in many ways it is. Because, you know, as a young girl, every woman, every adult female I knew was either a housewife, mother, a maid aunt that worked in a shop, or a teacher nun. They say, you know, you can't be it if you can't see it. Well, I couldn't see it, but I did somehow be it. And that's a good thing, that a girl now sees women doing almost everything. There's almost nothing that a girl can look out in the world and not see a woman doing. And that is progress. It's definitely progress. But, you know, there's been a kind of co-opting, a blandifying involved in mainstreaming some of these issues we were raising in these struggles. And so what we have beheld now is the rise of identity politics and a kind of aggressive marginalization of class. So why is there so much focus on identity today? You see, we have to think seriously about you know, why. And, you know, a lot of these things that, you know, we argue against, there is a germ of truth in them that we have to think seriously about. Why has identity become so problematic? Because identity is much more complicated today than it was in the past. Many of our ancestors, you know, never moved outside of a very small geographic area. You go back not even so far, and they weren't even literate. And so the horizons were small. And like, you know, my grandparents and my parents and grandparents didn't really think that much about their identity. As a child, I didn't. I mean, I was Irish, Catholic, and middle classes, which is what the Americans call the working class. And, you know, that's what it was. But like, you know, I lost my belief in, you know, the nation, which was the USA. I was taught it was the greatest country in the history of the world. And, you know, by the time I was in my 20s, I thought it was probably the most evil country in the history of the world, with good reason. I lost my belief in God. You know, that I was always uncomfortable with the gender division of labor. You know, there was a women's liberation movement, and I was part of that, and I was part of this whole process, redefining what does it mean to be masculine and what does it mean to be feminine. This isn't only about what jobs people do, but who's rational and who's emotional. You know, who belongs primarily in the domestic sphere, who does the work of the wider world. And I was part of that great ferment, and so my identity changed. You know, like most people my age, this is not just me personally. This is a massive, you know, social story. And not only that, but like I studied the history of philosophy, and the history of philosophy became part of my history. My history wasn't just the history of Ireland or the American working class, but the history of philosophy became part of my identity. Understand? I mean, incorporate all these things into who I became, and this is true. You know, this is a common story. What I'm saying now, and so you know, identities are more complex. You know, we've redefined ourselves in a way previous generations did not. My parents and grandparents and you know their predecessors did not go through this, and this is true for most of us in this room. So identity has become problematic, and you know there's a certain amount of focus on it, and also it's also like mobility. You know, like as I say, most of our ancestors never moved beyond a small geographic area. You know, even children now are, you know, on flights all over the world, and most of us have been to many places. And, you know, if you're in a place seriously, you incorporate something of that into yourself. And so here's just a poem that I found when I was rummaging around on the internet. I don't know anything about the poet here. But I am made from all the people I've encountered and all the things I've experienced. Inside, I hold the laughter of my friends, the arguments with my parents, the chattering of young children, and the warmth of kind strangers. That kind of thing. So, you know, we have all of these much richer experiences of the world than our ancestors, but, you know, maybe lots of problems and conflicts that come with that too. And we have to sort all of that out. So a certain, you know, greater focus on identity in our times. There's a reason for it. There's a material basis for it. And we have to take that seriously and do serious thinking about that. But, you know, we have to ask, you know, are there problems that arise with this? And this obsession with identity, and individual identity, not just this whole sociological process that I'm talking about, but individual identity. And we have to ask in whose interests are the dominance of identity politics, and how should we address it? So there are different kinds of ID politics. There's the identity politics of the left. And basically, I think this is a disproportionate and a kind of out of focus stress on gender, race, and ethnicity. And oftentimes, it's a kind of attention to the micro grievances of the relatively privileged at the extent of the grievances of the seriously oppressed. And I think the left really has to get out of this.
Yeah.
It's just so out of focus. And oftentimes, you know, individualistic and self-indulgent. there's the ID politics of the centre, and this kind of bland diversity and inclusion agenda, which, you know, it sounds very uncontroversial. But the thing is, yes, everybody, you know, every gender, every race, every nationality, but it doesn't deal with questions of power. And that's the crucial thing. And then there's this ID politics of the right, which is all about blood and soil. And white males is now the oppressed. And there's this whole great replacement theory, in hostility to migration, and a kind of resurgence of ethno-nationalism. And my issue with all of these, what the left's issue with all of these should be, all of the above dissipate focus from the real structures of power and the real mechanisms of oppression. And we have to, it's our job to get all of this in focus, even if these things need attention and need serious analysis. You don't understand anything properly without understanding its relation to everything else, and in the right proportion. So, you're probably familiar with intersectionality theory. And again, there's a truth in this, in that class, race, gender, ethnicity do intersect with each other. They do. But how do they intersect? And the thing is, most intersectionality theory does not give due weight to class. Class is somehow, sometimes, often, maybe even in there, but it's just one more thing among others. And it even doesn't understand how these other things relate to class, how often racial and gender oppression actually take the form of class oppression. Because who is it, by the way, that does all the difficult work of the world? And so there's a lot of, we fought hard, my generation, for gender studies, for history from below, for race studies, all of this. But they, you know, and they do have their origins in progressive movements. But again, they've just become captured by this out-of-focus identity politics and a kind of myopic separatism. And there's privilege theory. You know privilege theory. Now again, with all of these things, there's some truth in it. You know, it's important for people to understand how relatively privileged they are in relation to everything else. I mean, most of us are not the oppressed of the earth, but we're not the masters of the universe either. And, you know, and so there were a lot of people, you know, say my generation of the U.S. New Left, you know, constantly talking about white skin privilege. Okay, you know, if you're white and dressed in a certain way, you're not as likely to be beat up by the cops on the street. This is true, and this needs to be taken seriously. We must take it seriously. But as an awful lot of meetings from the 60s, and it's still going on now, with white people guilt-tripping each other about being white in a way that is just not productive or meaningful. In fact, I was at a kind of online webinar a couple of months ago, and a guy who works as a carpenter, and he's a member of the American Communist Party. And he said, like, guys, you know, people in his branch are always saying, yeah, bring along your co-workers. And he said, I couldn't bring my co-workers to all of these meetings where they're asked to declare their pronouns, where a woman, you know, who's working all hours of the day with a couple of kids in a trailer park is asked to check her privilege because she's white. Just, you know, and this, you know, this is how all this plays out. And it's ridiculous and it's counterproductive. So yeah, you know, we need to understand, you know, our relative privilege, but like use it. I mean, look, you know, look at Engels. You know, he just walked into a share in a thriving capitalist business. But what did he do with it? You know, these are the, you know, the questions that we have to bring to bear. So Marxism stands in. I love this meme. Have a look at it. It just says so much about all of this out-of-focus identity politics. We now live in a world where the richest 8 men own more than the poorest 3.6 billion. And then Lisa Simpson says, that's outrageous. At least 4 of them should be women of color. It's just brilliant the way it shows the difference. And the difference between Marxism and liberalism, postmodernism, various versions of feminism, anti-racism, and decoloniality. This decoloniality, it's like, it's a softening thing. What about anti-colonialism? This decoloniality, it's, you know, it doesn't deal with questions of power in a way that's in focus. Again, it's a progressive impulse, but it goes off into a blind alley. Here's another variation of the Simpsons cartoon. You've probably seen this one. This has been circulating on the internet lately. They say the next bombs will be sent by a woman. Don't we live in great times? You know? Yeah, Kamala Harris is a woman of color. You know? But what? You know? Where does that get all the, you know, the oppressed in the earth who are people of color? Where does that get, you know, the mass of women of color in the world? Because a lot of how gender and racial oppression plays out is about where people are in the social division of labor. The social division of labor is key to who does all of the really difficult jobs of the world. And this is how a lot of racial oppression came to be, by the way. And this is important to think about the political economy of identity politics, the political economy of race and gender oppression. Of course, gender oppression goes way back, but it's rooted in the social division of labor. I don't know how many of you have read Engels' absolutely brilliant book, The Origin of
Family,
private, The Origin of Family, Private Property, and the State. It's absolutely brilliant because I was a 1960s feminist and I read this around 1970. I thought, wow, you know, this was written by a 19th century man, and this is actually more advanced than a lot of the feminist theory I'm reading in my times. And it is, because it sees the political economy of gender. And basically his argument is that it's rooted in the, you know, the social division of labor. And basically when a surplus arose, there's a certain social gender division of labor that's inherent in biology, of course, because of childbearing. But when societies advanced and a surplus arose in the area of production that men were responsible for, that is when a lot of gender oppression came into the scene historically. Race, you know, a lot of it was justification of colonialism and slavery. And so much race, gender, ethnic oppression is really class oppression. There's a material basis for it in a struggle over resources and the social division of labor. And there are all these co-optation mechanisms diverting the focus from causes to symptoms, from symptoms to prejudices. It's not about, I mean, okay, you know, maybe some people, you know, it got to be said, it got to be thought that somehow, you know, white people are beautiful and black people are ugly. It was a justification for slavery. But a lot of this was internalized. You know, why do so many black people, even now in, you know, liberated South Africa, do women still buy gender lightening creams and, you know, hair straighteners? It's, you know, why? It's rooted in this. And so, and you know, when Black Power came on and said black is beautiful, you know, that's progressive. That was a good thing. But it needs to be in focus with everything else. And so again, this you have to get away from this obsession with the micro grievances of the privilege at the expense of you know, the real exploitation of those at the bottom of the class pyramid, who are disproportionately of certain races and genders. You see this cartoon, this sort of, you see, maybe you can read it from there. This shows like a black worker and this, you know, white worker. And you have this Murdoch character saying, careful mate, that foreigner wants to eat your cookies. And meanwhile, he's got all the cookies. He has a plate with one cookie. This guy has no cookies. And then this, you know, the capitalist figure has a whole plate, pyramid full of cookies. Careful mate, he wants to take your cookie. You know, sometimes a cartoon can do wonders. Marxism and identity politics. Again, Marxism is a critique of this focusing is getting into good focus the relationship of gender, race, ethnicity, and other factors in the relation to class. And it does this within an integral philosophy. This is a key thing, to have philosophical foundations for doing this, to have a clear way of thinking about everything. And Marxism is a theory that relates everything to everything else. And it does this in a way that is grounded in the realities of political economy, where the core concept is a mode of production. This is the key thing about Marxism and all these other tendencies. It's naming the system, countering the power of the system to co-opt, to divide and to conquer, in articulating a systemic critique. And beyond that, even forging a path. First of all, a vision of a new system, and then in political activity that forges a path to a new system. And a transition somehow, and it's become so complicated to know how to do this in our times. Somehow, a path from capitalism to socialism. I mean, to me, it's so clear that capitalism is the problem and socialism is the solution. But how do we get from here to there? That's not so clear. And that's what we need our best minds to be thinking about and active about. So, you know, there's a whole class dimension to the marginalization of class analysis and a whole class dimension to opposition to Marxism. And so the question about that is cui bono, who benefits? Who benefits from the marginalization of class analysis? Who benefits from, you know, the marginalization and opposition to Marxism? It's clear. So.
Well done. Now you know what I meant when I said a bucket of cold water thrown over people. If that doesn't wake you up and make you interested in socialism, all I can say is God help you. Anyway, look, I want to thank Helena for the lecture. I think it gives us so much to think about and to talk about. And there's one thing I would say about it. They say, you know, the whole idea of philosophy is to live an examined life. That lecture has taught us that you have lived an examined life and you're still examining things. It's so important for us to think about where we go, what we do, and how we do it, and to get the time and the space to do it. So look, I'll open the thing up to questions or comments.